Things are not always easy. And when they're easy, sometimes that's when they're the hardest. Jihad, 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 as they say. But they don't really present it in the news like one might understand it. Some of these things go a lot more smooth and less leftist than one might think. And of course, we need to define some terms. The middle path law, the law that one, prefers, certainly, Sharia law is different than a lot of what people hear of. And that includes possible jurisprudence. Some things may be lost in translation, and some things may not. The point is to make texts like this accessible. And some are so good that other authors don't really need to write and put out their own unique text in order to get things across for their time. And that's part of the thing about it not being at times a total or word for word translation. Kindness, justice, fairness, communal tradition, the consideration of the movements and claims according to what was revealed to Prophet Muhammad and what he was inspired to teach, which teachings to carry out, aligning with scholarship, and disaligning with ways attributed to those who misassociate with divinity, those who misbelieve, are the key principles of this book, along with not jumping the gun about saying that such and such is a fulfillment of a prophecy. Like if you were to say that there was an end times volcanic event or end times this, that, or the other, well, some of that stuff repeats itself. And you want to be careful not to fall into narrowed interpretations that if it turns out not to be true, that it will break the faith of those that relied upon it, or it will keep people from faith because they're like, see, you got it wrong. Just like those other people that are trying to interpret the seven-headed leopard and, that sort of stuff that you hear with sermon after sermon about the Bible. Every time and place had its true way. It had something which it wasn't up to the teachers or the practitioners of religion to force them into accepting. Either they accepted or they didn't. It wasn't up to that. Sometimes the best of conveyors only convince a few. So let's not be harsh in judging the prophets who were only able to convince a few people. Regard the possibilities of trial and don't seek them out. Yes, hardship can be a means of merit and reward. It can be a means of atonement and effacing. But you don't seek out hardship for itself. And so, regardless, we should encourage good and truth and discourage evil and ignorance. we should realize that things change over time. And like the saying, I'm not sure at this point in our program, I've read the book, whether or not it mentions that thing that's said in so many sermons, that the new thing that is not part of the religion, that's not acceptable within the deen, will be thrown back at them. And every merely thinking for oneself is a going astray, and a going astray is to the hellfire. We need to go beyond personal opinion, beyond communal opinions. We need to figure out, based on what made rightly guided successors rightly guided, and in what ways were they rightly guided. We should have rifq, kindness regarding everything. And that includes when a punishment is needed. Like when I talked about Layla Ahmed's book, one of the things that I may not have said is that a person's punishment, we need to distinguish when it comes to punishment what has been prescribed. If it's done over, that's not kind. If it's done less, again, that's not kind to the overall. And, the parents that hit people upside the head and stuff like this as part of disciplining their child, that's just not part of it, right? So even dealing with the criminal, we need to be kind. The criminal that you execute, as soon as you can show that they're guilty, well, sometimes you might wait till day to get a bigger audience, but the government's got to do that. I'm not saying vigilante, but this is done. They still have their dignity. Let them say their last words. If they want to pray or do some appropriate little ritual of their own, by appropriate is probably the wrong word, but you know what I mean. Their religious freedom, as long as they don't have to expose themselves to everybody. There are people who want to do that, and then you stop them. But other than that, you still show them their dignity, whether they're of your group or not. Halim, you want to have clemency. Al-Ana, you want to be able to deliberate. So there is a foundation of democracy. But remember, a democracy based on a constitution of what has been revealed and inspired for this age. And let us remember that religion, as the secularists will call it, is not enforced. I mean, you go to the place of worship and they will hold you back if you're not modest or you have graven images or something, or sometimes they'll help you to, here's something to wear, while you're in this building because, but next time. Then, of course, is the hulm, toleration. Again, toleration isn't encouragement of what is wrong. Toleration is something that a person is, you realize that the change isn't total or automatic, and so you pave the way for what you can. Surah 17, Ayat 32 is one of those verses that would indicate that we should, withhold our judgment. And, so in this case, it's the understanding. We should have the knowledge of what to believe, what not to believe, what to do, what not to do, at least in broad forms, and then work our way towards it. Because it's easier to deal with, well, I didn't act because I didn't know, than it is to deal with all the things that you could have done, despite what that one song in that Locust Abortion Technician album, I think that was the name of that album. I'll leave off the name of the band because of do what is right, regardless of national or family or other general alliances. Don't differ just to differ. And if in some ways you do differ, say, hey, we're both trying to be upon what Prophet Muhammad taught. And then, that sectarian strife fades away. If you just admit to each other, hey, this is what I'm trying to be upon, and you say you're trying to be upon that too. So the general Sunni position about ijtihad is, it's based on a Quranic verse. I don't remember the Quranic verse, but there's this phrase in the Quran, the way of the believers. Now, the way of the believers is, as said before, the Quran and what Prophet Muhammad taught. So therefore, as you'll see elsewhere, that if everybody agrees that's Muslim and trying to be authentic about it, that this is the way, then, there's, it becomes self-justifying. Everything counts, and we need to be concerning of what our testimonies actually mean. Some things are for, just sharing and acting out whenever. Some things are not. And certain things you can't implement. When I say that I believe in the death penalty and all that other stuff, it's like, yeah, I say the government should. And we're working towards a better society where that becomes a proper deterrent rather than 20 years in prison on the way or that sort of stuff. And there's also stuff that some people learn, like, oh, who were the hypocrites and all that. And it's like, well, the point was just to bring up the rightful action in everybody. It wasn't to, just go around condemning and condoning people. So that's another thing to consider too, because hate should be in regards to misassociation, misbelief, misdeeds, but not the people. So you kind of don't want that perception to be out there, that it's about the people. And a lot of people are just like, oh, see, K-Burn conduct, or we're about, yeah, but it wasn't. Well, okay, you can't say you know what it's about if you think it was about them being Jews. No, that had nothing to do with it. It was for actions. It was for what was supported by these people. Imam Ahmed didn't want to include narrations in his musnad that would be considered as against the rulers. The Shia were like, you have to relate that stuff. So it's harder to find it in the Sunni sources. Abu Yusuf didn't want to relate things that sounded strange. Well, maybe not by itself, but more like, you invite people towards what they don't know by what they know. Imam Malik didn't want things that, if told by themselves, might lead people to misunderstand things about God. Hudhaifa thought that people may not need some of the narrations that he talked about. Now, there's a lot of narrations about the Prophet, acts for this on the way to the bathroom, or that or the other, and that sort of stuff. And you can kind of make arguments like that, well, it's not needed to talk about that. There's only a few things being taught out of those hundreds of narrations that have been passed on in the Sunni books, for example, and maybe you should just talk about that. Now, the scholars that read through it and make their own judgment and say, this is what I'm going to relate, okay, but it's probably not productive to hold big, long, many night discussions, months of discussions and teachings over the way Muhammad walked around rooms, or acts for things on the way to the bathroom, or how much he ate of this at this meal or that, sort of stuff. Abu Huraira, what he didn't narrate, I think I've already mentioned it. I just want to make sure. It's the stuff about here are trials. Here's some issues that it's important for some to know, but it's not, for the rest of the community, like the list of the hypocrites and that sort of stuff. But overarchingly is the principle of protecting the religion. So the religious places and the religious practice, that's the importance to bring up. I talk about anything, about any path, really, all, so, maybe I go too far in that. I'm not trying to. I'm reporting on what is. And if I let people say in an interview what they personally believe and do, well, that's what they personally believe and do. And I'm wanting that to get out there, that that's really something that exists. But my point in any of it is not the mentioning of evil for entertainment. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds are reasons that we should align with others. And we can align because of this, that, and the other without approving of all the rest. So when you see a book, if you see an individual that I've talked to or whatever, I'm not doing this to approve of everything in that book. Certainly a religious book with religious commentary, I may agree with the base. I may agree with the Arabic, but the comment, the translation, I may not agree with everything. Either personally or representing sort of a collective opinion. But people act like that. So, I'm agreeing with what is good and true. I'm trying to do that. Some things do not make a difference with the actual issues. So we're also kind of staying away of that too. That it's just wandering talk to wander talk. Like if you wash your hands to the elbows, well, do you do the front or the back or the side, or, you don't need to discuss all the little variations of that. Just give a quick rundown, move on to something else, because some of these lectures just become too boring that people only, like they're doing penance to even listen to it. And I've seen how people react. And some of that stuff, it's like people are doing penance to even just sit around. And you kind of want to go beyond that, right? Just like you wouldn't help somebody in wrongful belief and wrongful action in an explicit sense, you don't want to help them against the believing side. Now, you may call forth correction, but, you don't join in the armies like Surah 4 indicates, that those who knowingly fight and kill a believer, the exceptions is self-defense and that sort of stuff. Well, there's the reaction for that. So any of the any of the wars for mere nationalistic things, you end up killing people that are even of one's own faith, and that's the strongest listing against you. That's why we have the reference in the Quran that, part of the reason why some of these wars didn't take place is because you would have ended up killing people who were believers. And we need to avoid aligning with people of misbelief, misassociation, misdeeds for merely worldly things. Yeah, sometimes you need to survive and that sort of stuff. But the point is not the preference in friendship or any of that. We can have treaties with those who disbelieve. We can be wary of people just saying, oh, they descend from the prophet, or they descend from a scholar, or they We're raised a certain way, but what are they, right? And how internal strifes will arise. But trying to be too specific about, this right here is the fulfillment. That's something to be very, very careful of. And one of the things rising right now is the afterlife and end times, day of judgment related largely speculations, but it's packaged like it's fully supported. Now, some things may seem strange, and that's because there's a lot of things that were actually narrated authentically about what the prophet taught, and you just personally don't know them all. But sometimes things will come up that seem totally new. What we want is a broader mercy.